Welcome to our 10th week guest speaker series. My name is Mike Yaley. I'm the director at the Lair. Thank you for joining us. I see some familiar faces, folks who've been joining throughout the summer, but a lot of names that are here just for 10th week. So thank you for being here. A couple things before we start. A reminder that we are recording this. So if you don't want to be on the recording, just hit the stop video button on your Zoom and just listen in. Secondly, we will be taking questions. So please, as questions come along, put them in the chat. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go through the questions and we'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers. All right, and I'm gonna introduce our speaker tonight, Munis Faruqui. His presentation is The Theft That Created the Modern World. And in the late 1580s, a Dutchman named Jan van Linschoten left his job as the secretary to the Portuguese Archbishop of Goa in India. In his possession, as he headed back to Europe, were maps and detailed nautical information about how to sail from Europe to India and back again. This information was priceless. The Portuguese have been jealously guarding it from other European competitors, especially the Dutch and the English, for almost a century. Lin Scorton's theft and his subsequent publication of the maps broke the Portuguese monopoly over sea routes to India and inaugurated a new world order in which first the Dutch and then the English would become the dominant European power in Asia and the Indian Ocean. Munis D. Faruqui is a historian in the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies and director of the Institute for South Asia Studies at Cal. In 2014, Dr. Faruqui was one of 3 recipients of UC Berkeley's most prestigious honor for teaching, the Distinguished Teaching Award. And I am very pleased to announce our guest speaker. Please welcome Munis Faruqui.
Thanks, Mike. What a pleasure to be here. I must confess, I am so, sad, distressed, pick whatever word you want, that I can't be up with all of you. But nonetheless, thank you, Mike. It was great to see Pat a little earlier on and Kathy as well, for giving me this chance to speak. Not an ideal setting, but nonetheless, here we are. So tonight's conversation is going to be about the theft that created the modern world. And let me just step back at this point to just say that our story doesn't really begin with Lin Scorton, but actually a couple of centuries before in, say the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, a time when, Europe had decided that it was going to try to reclaim the Holy Lands through the Crusades, which were, of course, extremely impactful. But for the purposes of my story, the Crusades were really important because they kind of inaugurated a new set of tastes among Europeans, a set of tastes that would result in an interest in spices. And so spices like nutmeg, pepper, cardamom, cinnamon, ginger, turmeric, these were spices that the Europeans prior to the Crusades were not particularly familiar with, but they certainly became familiar with them after the Crusades and, took a liking to for various purposes, whether to use in cooking or as preservatives or for other reasons. In any case, one of the outcomes of the Crusades was not just a renewed interest, not renewed, but an interest in spices, but also the creation of a monopoly that was dominated by 2 states. One was a city-state, Venice, at the high end of the Adriatic, and my little cursor should show where Venice is located, roughly up there. And its ally, which was...
Hey, Munis, Munis, we're not seeing your screen. I don't think you've shared the screen yet.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, hold on a second. I thought the screen was shared for some reason. Just to say a few words, just to recap, we have Crusades happening about 1,000 years ago. Europe suddenly has an interest in spices. Most of the spices are coming from South Asia, which is basically the Indian subcontinent, or coming from Southeast Asia. And in the process, essentially the Europeans get exposed to such spices as, nutmeg, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, ginger, turmeric. And the problem for countries that lie further to the west in Europe or in the north is that essentially Venice, which is at the top of the Adriatic seen over there, and Egypt end up monopolizing the trade together. They are allies and very curious ones at that, because on the one hand, Egypt is a predominantly Muslim kingdom at this time, and Venice is a Catholic city-state. But the two of them basically monopolize the movement of spices across the Indian Ocean, through the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. And of course, this creates a very serious problem for anyone who happens to be far removed from either Egypt or the Italian peninsula. The further removed you are, whether you are in Scandinavia or you happen to be in the Iberian Peninsula, either way, price starts to go up. And of course, the big problem for kingdoms like Portugal, but also the various Spanish kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, others, is that this causes a horrible drain of precious metals that they don't really have, specifically gold and silver. And so starting in the early 1400s, you have a character by the name of Henry the Navigator, who many of you have probably encountered at various points in your history classes or elsewhere. He becomes really interested in the possibility of exploring whether there are routes to India that bypass the Mediterranean. And so he starts to send the first expeditions out of Portugal, heading south basically on the back head of Africa, and my cursor is basically going to follow it. And over the course of the next many decades, the Portuguese will send continuous expeditions along the western edge of Africa that in the 1460s will end up basically realizing that Africa has a rounded end, which is basically where Nigeria, Ghana, and some of those contemporary countries are. And then they will begin to realize that, if you keep going further south, eventually you will hit the Cape of Good Hope, which is in South Africa today. And it is in the late 1480s that a guy by the name of Bartholomew Diaz figures out that Africa does not keep going, but actually rounds, and eventually the presumption is that it's going to head northwards again. Where exactly, they're not entirely clear. Anyway, Diaz heads back to Portugal, and in the late 1490s, another expedition is set up by the Portuguese to basically explore the possibility of getting to India via South Africa. And of course, bingo, they end up in Western India in 1498 in a port town called Calicut. Okay, it's on your PowerPoint over there. So the Portuguese essentially managed to find a way to break the big monopoly that Venice and Egypt had cobbled together and benefited from for some centuries. And in the process, they go about creating a maritime empire. And in some ways, the heyday of the Portuguese maritime empires from the 1490s, 1498 to be precise, to the early 1600s. And what you see in the PowerPoint is essentially a map with the green parts indicating where Portugal ends up becoming, in a sense, dominant. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The thing that I'd like to really draw your attention to, though, is that, Portugal will end up creating a maritime empire that extends not just from Southern Africa up the coast of Africa, but it extends across the Indian Ocean to India and beyond into Southeast Asia further to the east. And you would think, I often ask my students, I'm like, listen, so how many ships do you presume the Portuguese required to, essentially create a stranglehold on this entire region? And my students often say something like, a couple hundred ships, and I ask them how many people, and they say, tens of thousands. And the numbers are much, much smaller. We're talking essentially at any given time about 5,000 Portuguese soldiers and administrators and about 30 ships. And that's what they use to essentially create this new maritime empire that we are basically looking at on the PowerPoint. In any case, the reasons for Portuguese success are quite remarkable. And, there are a whole bunch of reasons, and there might be historians among you who will offer another 7. But let me just give you, in a sense, my, top few. What the Portuguese bring to the Indian Ocean is a new kind of philosophy. It's called mercantilism. And essentially what mercantilism is about is this idea that any sort of trade is a zero-sum game. if you are making money, it means that I'm losing money. If I'm making money, you're losing money. And so coming out of a very competitive economic environment in Europe, but specifically in Northern Europe, mercantilism really is this kind of zero-sum ideology, trading economic ideology that was very peculiar to Europe, but had never been applied or seen even in the Indian Ocean. And so by contrast, in the Indian Ocean prior to the 1500s, trade was open-ended. Anyone could trade. No state tried to control the volume moving across the Indian Ocean. And as a result, groups like Armenians, Jews, Arabs, Persians, Malays, Chinese, Indians of various kinds, all participated in this trade and made this trading zone an extraordinarily vibrant one. The Portuguese come in and they begin to try to take out competitors and essentially monopolize trade in the Indian Ocean to their benefit. So one of the reasons for Portuguese success is that mercantilism is a shock. No one has encountered it before, and no one has had any experience of this and how to counteract it and undermine it. So that certainly is one of the important reasons to begin with. The Portuguese, to enforce mercantilism, put guns on their ships. And again, putting cannon on ships was a new phenomena, at least in the Indian Ocean. It had been done in Europe for a while now, but not in the Indian Ocean. And so when the Portuguese arrive with guns on their ships, they basically start to blow the competition out of the water with really good effect. The third reason for Portuguese success, and again, 5,000 people, 30 ships, it's not many, has to do with this really interesting phenomena called the Cartage. Okay, so the Cartage, just to give you a sense of what it is, it's basically a license. It's a small little piece of paper, and it's a license that you have to buy from the Portuguese authorities. This little license, this little piece of paper will list, what goods you have on your ship. So if you are an Indian, Arab, Jewish merchant, and you are, if you are concerned that you might bump into the Portuguese, one way of preempting them from confiscating your goods, perhaps killing you, perhaps, sinking your ship, doing more, horrible things to your crew, is to just simply buy the Cartage. And the Cartage wasn't a terribly expensive thing to buy, but it was inconvenient to get because you had to transport yourself to a Portuguese settlement, then tell them exactly how many, what value of goods you were transporting. So many people avoided buying the Cartage. The problem was that if you were caught without a Cartage by the Portuguese, which was not a very, it was not a huge likelihood, but God forbid you were, caught without a Cartage, they would do horrible things to you and your crew and your ship. And oftentimes, to kind of enforce the point, the Portuguese would drag ships basically to the mouths of port cities and other settlements where they would, inflict physical torture and other kinds of brutalities in full view of, denizens in the city, on the coast, so that they could see what the consequences of not buying the Cartage was. So effectively, it was state-sponsored terrorism that the Portuguese were engaged in. But beyond that, and perhaps the most effective way in which the Portuguese controlled this world was by just understanding the geography of the Indian Ocean, okay? And understanding that there were a few key choke points across the Indian Ocean that if you control them, you basically can control the movement of goods. You don't have to control every square inch of territory across the zone. And the Portuguese never aspire, they don't have the manpower, they don't have the resources to control the entire Indian Ocean. So what they do instead is they basically find important geographic choke points and they take them over. So for example, if you're looking at the PowerPoint right now, and I'm moving my cursor again, in the Far East, the Portuguese take over the settlement of Macau. Macau is on the southern end of China. Any trade that is moving from Korea, Japan, northern China, down the coast, they can control it from Macau. Okay, moving further into Southeast Asia, the Portuguese figure out that there's a small, narrow strait that connects Southeast Asia to the Bay of Bengal to the west, which is the region over, here. And if you can control any movement of goods through Southeast Asia into the Indian Ocean by controlling Malacca, which sits at the end of a long peninsula. So if you put a fort at the end of the Straits of Malacca, you can control basically much of the traffic, human and commodity traffic that's moving either eastwards or westwards. Now, to try and control the movement of certain kinds of spices, specifically clove, which is only grown in a few islands in Southeast Asia, to try to control the movement of spices from Southeast Asia, they basically capture an island called Timor in what is now Indonesia. Well, it's an independent country now, but it was once part of Indonesia. From Timor, again, they're able to control the movement of, people and goods out of Southeast Asia from the southern end of the archipelago. Moving, to the west, the present capital of Sri Lanka, Colombo, is captured by the Portuguese. It controls the movement of trade up and down the eastern coast of India. Then they capture a whole bunch of places along the western coast of India. Again, these are small port settlements, but they are strategically located and intended to essentially funnel traffic to Portuguese strongholds for taxation purposes. The most important settlement along the coast of Western India, which will become the capital of the Portuguese Empire in the Asian world, is the city of Goa, located midway along the coast of Western India. Again, the purpose is to control trade moving up the coast of India, but also trade moving down. Further to the west, if you look at the Persian Gulf over here, where a lot of trade moved, first along a sea route over here into the Persian Gulf, and then along land routes across the Middle East, there's a small little island, and it's literally just a speck called Hormuz, but it sits squarely in the heart of the Persian Gulf. You control Hormuz, you put a fort on top, and you basically control the Persian Gulf. The same is true for the city of Aden, which controls the Red Sea. And then you have a whole string of fortresses along the eastern and western coasts of Africa. So all in all, we're talking maybe about 20, 25 settlements. And these are truly settlements. They're not much bigger than that. But with this, the Portuguese really are able to skim a fairly large share of the trade that is moving across the Indian Ocean. Now, of course, this makes Lisbon the center of essentially an extraordinarily lucrative trade that is moving from Asia, across through the maritime routes onwards to Europe, but also into increasingly the New World. And one of the things that the Portuguese do to try to ensure that their profits remain high is that they limit the number of ships that are plying these routes. And of course, this is a state monopoly. So these are not, what the Portuguese don't do, which will happen later on, I'll come to that in a second, they don't create private enterprises. This is all crown-run stuff. And the Portuguese crown is trying to make all the money. So in an effort to try to monopolize not just its authority, but also as a way of keeping prices really high, the crown basically orders that you're only going to have 5 big ships, plying the Atlantic routes, and that these ships would have a certain tonnage, which is about 400 cubic capacity. And of course, that's nothing. But it ensures that the price of any product coming to Lisbon is going to be extremely high, because God forbid you lose one of these ships. That will jack up prices and cause everyone else to have to pay an even larger premium than they would otherwise have paid. But the result, of course, is that Lisbon becomes one of the richest cities in Europe in the 1500s. And it will remain so till Portugal is taken over by Philip II of Spain. Now, it's a very complicated story, but essentially the Portuguese crown did not have an heir. Philip II of Spain was the closest relative, and therefore he essentially gets control of Portugal in 1580. Now, Philip II is really an interesting character, because he's an extraordinarily driven administrator. He is a fairly effective ruler. Methodical, really interested in the minutiae of governance. But along with that, he was also a very devout Catholic. And, he was really disturbed by the fact that Northern Europe had increasingly, moved towards, Lutheranism, Calvinism, other denominations of the Protestant faith. And he was determined to reimpose Catholicism. And one of the ways in which he was going to do so was by essentially depriving the Northern European Protestant states access to spices. And the way he would do that was by keeping them out of Spain. So orders were basically passed after 1580 that no Northern Europeans, unless they were Catholics, would be allowed to trade with Lisbon. And of course, this creates its own dynamic, and specifically that the Northern Europeans are forced to try to engage in various kinds of countermeasures. They have no choice. So how do the Northern Europeans respond? Well, they do so by trying to explore various passages to the north of Europe, okay? And these are the northwestern and northeastern passages. The northwestern passage is essentially an attempt to try to find a way to bypass Spanish control of the central and southern Atlantic by taking routes toward Baffin Island, across, southern Greenland, into what is now Canada, and hoping that, you will somehow find a way through the ice to Asia. The other way to try to do this was taking the northeastern passage, which was going in the opposite direction, essentially trying to find a way to Asia using the routes along what is now Russia, okay, northern Russia. The problem at this time, unlike today, is that Europe was experiencing and the world was experiencing a mini ice age. And this meant that the routes to the north and the east, the northwest and the northeast were basically, encased in ice for much of the year. And weather patterns were such that whatever opening would happen would be literally not for enough time to get you through either passage. And many, many, many a European trader, traveler, entrepreneur, adventurer essentially got caught in the ice, and most of them perished. Some of them managed to make their way back. But the Europeans quickly realized that the northeastern, northwestern passages were not going to work. So the other response was through essentially pirating. And again, many of you have probably encountered stories about the great English buccaneers. I mean, they were essentially pirates. Buccaneers, a nice term for them. But people like Francis Drake, seen over here on your left, but also others like Hawkins, Sir John Hawkins, and a whole bunch of other Europeans who managed to bypass Portuguese and Spanish naval ships that are patrolling the middle Atlantic. They make their way into the Caribbean and the South Atlantic. They engage in various kinds of adventures, and the rest is, in a sense, part of the history books of Northern European buccaneering. But the more immediate challenge for the Northern European states was that they were bottled up by the Great Spanish Armada. The Spanish essentially after 1580 cobbled together a massive fleet that they had hoped would, essentially not just bottle up Northern Europe, but be used as a way of invading England and reimposing Catholicism. So in 1588, 1587 actually, Philip moves the Spanish Armada north to try to prepare for an invasion of England. But the Armada for many years before that moment essentially kept the Europeans bottled in. They did not want to run the risk of encountering this Armada, which was effectively blockading Northern Europe. The second problem was that the Northern Europeans didn't have much money. They did not have access to gold and silver in huge quantities. And for that reason, money was always going to be an issue. And if you're going to do anything in life where you have to buy resources or ships, people, expertise, you need money. And these Northern European states, for the most part, did not have money. And certainly the crowns did not have money. So that was problem number two. Problem number three was that these Northern European states had no geographic knowledge of the Southern Atlantic, let alone the Indian Ocean. Most Northern Europeans, in fact, almost none had ever been to the Indian Ocean. They had no idea what its geography was like. And the Portuguese had very studiously protected the kind of dissemination of this information to the Northern Europeans, fearing that if they got their hands on this information, it would break the Portuguese monopoly. So there were certain very basic problems faced by the Northern Europeans. So what happens next is essentially the meat of today's talk, which is to say, somehow the Northern Europeans catch a whole bunch of lucky breaks. And the first one is that in 1588, the Spanish Armada is destroyed off the coast of southern England. It goes down in a huge tempest or series of tempests, and all of a sudden, Spain and Portugal's capacity to bottle in the Northern Europeans is more or less gone. So this is the first big break that the Northern Europeans catch. The second big break, in a sense, is one that is slightly more long-standing, is that it's a discovery that you do not need to have the crown foot all the money for an expensive expedition, that there are ways to do things that don't require state enterprise and permission of the Spanish or Portuguese crowns or the English crown or whichever crown I'm talking about. Rather, it's through this instrument called the joint stock company, which is essentially a partnership where everyone puts in a little amount of money, risk gets spread across the board, and it allows for individual investors to buy stocks or shares in a company. They take on a little bit of the risk, but they get to share in any profits that follow if an expedition is successful. And one of the things that the Northern Europeans begin to work with is this idea of the joint stock company, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. But the biggest break of all, in a sense, was the man who gave the Northern Europeans the maps to get to the Indian Ocean, and then how to actually navigate through the Indian Ocean. And that is, in a sense, quote unquote, our hero of tonight's conversation, a man by the name of Jan van Linschoten. So you see him over there, he's this redhead fellow. He was a Dutchman. And I'll just say a few things about his, to give you some biographical details. He was born in 1563 in what is now the Netherlands, in Holland. He was a Catholic, he was born a Catholic. And his brothers, he had a couple of older brothers who for professional reasons ended up going to Spain, because Spain at the time was actually ruled Holland and Belgium as well. And so they were just following, in a sense, professional opportunities. These Dutchmen end up going down to Spain. And in the case of Lin Scorton, he ends up becoming a clerk to a clergyman, a Catholic clergyman, who is shortly after Lin Scorton is taken on as a secretary, a private secretary. This man, his name is Vicente da Fonseca, ends up being appointed the Archbishop of Goa. Now, Goa, if you recall, again, is the capital of the Portuguese Empire in Asia. Okay, it's the heart of Portuguese political and ecclesiastical power. And it's from Goa that, things like the Inquisition were run, the Catholic Church, based in Lisbon, but also the Portuguese Catholic Church would send expeditions to Japan and Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So Da Fonseca was a really important man. I mean, he was perhaps the second most powerful man in the Portuguese enterprise after the Governor General of Goa. And he is sent off as the Archbishop of Goa. And he, goes off in 1583, taking Lin Scorton with him. And Lin Scorton will stay in Goa for the next 5 years, essentially serving Da Fonseca. Now, the interesting thing about Lin Scorton's experience over there is that Lin Scorton, it turns out, was a really he's an interesting character. He was fairly well educated. He was someone who, had an interest in collecting precious objects. He, spent a certain amount of his time just collecting ethnographic information about the people around him, people who are coming in and out of Goa. And secretly, unknown to anyone else, our dear friend begins to start copying maps and charts. Now, these maps and charts are essentially navigational maps and charts that were housed in the palace of the Archbishop of Goa. These were the blueprints of the Portuguese Maritime Empire. And in a day before Dropbox and other ways of storing information, you needed to have copies in various places that, sea captains, adventurers, other individuals connected with the Portuguese Maritime Empire could, consult with in the library and use. So there was one set of maps, navigational charts, other kinds of valuable, invaluable information. I mean, 100 years worth of maritime information and other kinds of information was stored in the Archbishop's Palace, which was believed to be, one of the safest places in Asia. And of course, another set was in Lisbon. But what our friend Lin Scorton is doing at nights, he begins to start copying these maps. And he starts to make copies and he starts to keep them. Now, what happens is that in 1588, he decides to return to Europe. And his decision to return to Europe was partly decided by the fact that da Fonseca, his patron, passed away in Goa. And Lin Scorton realized that he was not going to have the same kind of professional opportunities with his patron gone. But in addition to that, his brothers had died, his father had died in Europe. He wanted to get married. He did not want to get married to one of the local mestizo women or to an Indian woman in Goa. And finally, as a Dutchman, and someone who was not a merchant, he was a secretary, and someone who was not Portuguese, his opportunities in Goa were fairly circumscribed. There was a real serious glass ceiling for a man like Lin Scorton. Incidentally, if you're looking at these images and wondering what they are, these are images that will come out of the book that Lin Scorton is going to publish in a couple of years that I'm going to talk about in a second. But you can see he's a fairly gifted artist. He was a very curious observer of people around him, and he, for the most part, had a very open mind, when absorbing information from people around him. So what ends up happening is he decides to leave Goa in 1588, and he spends the next 2 years on this kind of hairy journey back to Europe. And it's by all accounts, a terror-filled journey, because he suffers from, a couple of shipwrecks. They're attacked by British pirates. In the meanwhile, the Portuguese have realized that this man has copied some maps and is basically heading back to Europe with maps in his possession. So the Portuguese are sending basically, folks after him to try to capture him. Luckily for Lin Scorton, they get shipwrecked, and so he's always one step ahead of his pursuers. He finally gets back to Holland in 1592, and Holland at this time is engaged in a war of liberation against Spain, against Lin Scorton's former employers, so to speak. And Lin Scorton, who had been a Catholic up to this point, becomes a Protestant. He converts. And one of the things he does is he starts to join the hunt for various ways to get to Europe, to get to India from Europe. One of the ways, one of the expeditions that he gets involved in is led by a guy called Willem Barents, another Dutchman, who was trying to find a passage across the Northeast. And Barents will, engage in two expeditions, 1594, 95. Lin Scorton is on both of those expeditions, and they are both failures. They don't go anywhere. And Barents says, listen, join me for one final expedition. I'm sure that we're going to get to India on the third try. And Lin Scorton decides that he's not interested, and it's a very good thing that he didn't go, because it ends up that this expedition is an ill-fated one. Barents is killed, and this basically puts an end to Dutch efforts to try to find a way across the northern coast of Siberia to India. But Lin Scorton has, so much else going for him. And specifically, the most important thing is he's got these maps. He's got these charts. He's got this ethnographic information at his disposal. And he does what any enterprising individual with essentially blueprints to the most important trade routes, possibly, at the time, does. He decides to print a series of books. And in fact, he prints 3 volumes. And these volumes become known as a book called Itinerario. And you can see the first cover edition of Itinerario to the right of the screen. There are 3 volumes. The first one is focused on Asia and West Africa. It's essentially a gazetteer. The second volume focuses on Africa and America. And the third and most valuable volume of all for most sea captains was basically a detailed guide focused on shipping and sailing instructions. And, suffice it to say, Itinerario is an extraordinary bestseller. It is the second best-selling book of its time after the Bible. Everyone is trying to get their hands on it. And not surprisingly, it is immediately translated into a whole bunch of languages, including English in 1598, Latin in 1599, and a whole series of other European languages after that. So what happens to Lin Scorton? Essentially, he retires. He makes a ton of money. He marries extremely well. He retires back to his hometown. He becomes the mayor. He becomes the treasurer. He sets up the first hospital. And more than anything else, he takes on an aristocratic title. So the guy's name was Jan Huygens, and that's how most people would have known him till about 1600. And as he gets old, he basically buys himself an aristocratic title, and he becomes one Lin Scorton. Which was not his family name. He was, from fairly middling background, but he basically works his way up the Dutch class hierarchy and dies in 1611, a very, by all accounts, wealthy and self-satisfied man. Now, to kind of end this conversation with you, there are a whole series of really important impacts that follow on what he does. The most important one, perhaps, is that he opens up the possibility for Northern Europeans to get to India. And it's not surprising, Itinerary is published in 1595. And in 1595, very same year, the first Dutch expedition makes its way towards Southeast Asia, the East Indies, under a guy called Cornelius de Houtman, who you see over there in your PowerPoint. And Houtman is using information from not just Lin Scorton, but another guy called Petrus Plancius, and I'd be happy to say a few words about that guy. He's another very interesting character. A few years after that, the English set up the East India Company, which is a joint stock company. The crown doesn't have any money to basically outfit expeditions, so it looks to the private sector. The private sector sets up a joint stock company. And of course, the English East India Company becomes a really important player in the decades to come. 2 years later, the Dutch East India Company is set up. And all of this is following on a world of possibilities that has now been opened up by Lin Scorton's theft, so to speak. And, a few years, within a decade of 1602 and the Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company defeats the almighty Portuguese off the coast of India. And it just so happens that the Mughal emperor, the great Emperor Jahangir, happens to be sitting on the coast watching a big battle, naval battle unfold between this kind of upstart power called England and the Portuguese, who have been around for about a century. And the English defeat them, and the Mughal emperor is left kind of breathless and wondering, like, who are these English? And not surprisingly, within a few years, the first British ambassador arrives in India. His name is Sir Thomas Roe, seen over there in the second image. And he manages to get certain trading privileges from the Mughals to basically trade with India. Now, in some desperation, the Portuguese respond by trying to increase the size of their ships to grab more spices to move to Lisbon, in a way, trying to undercut the competition by flooding the market. The problem over here is that these larger ships start to run aground, and they are not as stable as the smaller Portuguese ships of the previous century, the 16th century. And you see certain figures over there for ship losses. Between 1500 and 1579, the Portuguese lost only about 9% of their ships. That number increases in the next few decades to about 33%. And these are increasingly unsustainable losses for the Portuguese. So not only are they confronted with aggressive Dutch and English actions against them, but they are also faced with this problem of ships that are not quite as capable as the previous generation of ships. And by the 1620s, 30s, the Dutch have increasingly emerged as the dominant power in the Indian Ocean. They not only defeat the Portuguese, they also defeat the English. And through this defeat, the Dutch essentially take control of Southeast Asia, kind of leaving India to the English and the Portuguese to kind of duke it out. Now, fast forward a few decades, and effectively what happens is that back in Europe, the English, under the leadership of a guy called Oliver Cromwell, engage in a whole series of campaigns against the Dutch and eventually will defeat Holland, with the result that they begin to take control of a lot of the possessions, the personnel, a lot of the expertise that the Dutch had themselves accrued at the expense of the Portuguese. So the English are not just beneficiaries of the destruction of Portuguese power, they also will then benefit from their own destruction of the Dutch in the Indian Ocean. And in a sense, the final straw comes in 1688, when England and Holland are united under a single crown, under William of Orange, who, although he's a Dutchman and speaks no English, and he becomes, the King of England, his interest in the last years of his life were really in kind of, propelling English power, even at the expense of Holland. And so by the time you start to move into the 18th century, England is really well positioned to become the heir to the Dutch Maritime Empire. And it is, in a sense, that increased capacity on the part of the English East India Company, which of course is running all these operations in the Indian Ocean, that eventually will result in a very consequential conquest of a place in Eastern India called Bengal in 1757. And again, I can't say this enough, Bengal at the time would have been the equivalent to Manhattan in relation to the United States today. It was the richest part of India. It was the heart of cotton and silk textile production. And just to give you a sense of why cotton and silk textiles were essentially, the most valuable product of the 18th century, it's because much of the world was undergoing a clothing revolution, and cloth was absolutely central to the purchase of slaves in Africa, the movement of, certain kinds of commodities onwards into Europe and into the Americas. It all started essentially with European purchases, specifically English purchases of cotton and silk textiles. And, again, just to give you a figure, India's share of the world economy in the 1750s was about 25%. Fast forward a century and a half, and it's about 2%. So essentially, the British move into one of the richest parts of the world, and they do so on the backs of a whole series of fortuitous events, including Lin Scorton's theft. And of course, what did the British do when they get their hands on Bengal? They basically begin to drain India of its money. And this money, a large share of it, ends up basically funding the first industrial revolution, which begins, and look at the dates. Bengal is captured in 1757. The first industrial revolution begins in the 1760s. There is a correlation between the draining of India's wealth and the rise of the first industrial revolution. This is not to suggest that the British don't have certain kinds of technological skills, but they need money to effectively fund what will become the first industrial revolution. That money comes from India. So, finally, we know this to be the case, that the first industrial revolution really sets England onto the path for world domination. The French try to take on the British with the Napoleonic Wars. They fail. Even the loss of the Americas, specifically the American colonies, not Canada, but the American colonies, barely dents British ambition, English ambition across the world. And of course, it eventually will result in the creation of the largest empire in human history. Well, actually, the Mongols were the largest, but the British are a very close second. And you can see British possessions in red over here. So anyway, to kind of close the conversation, I'd love to take questions for the last, 10, 15 minutes. Lin Scorton, I'm arguing over here, it is his theft that enables, in a sense, the destruction of the Portuguese monopoly and eventually opens the world up to first the Dutch and then eventually the English. And hence, it is the greatest theft in human history. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right. Well, again, please put your questions in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and just ask a question. I think we have a small enough crowd where that could work. I have a question right off the bat. Was Lin Scorton's motive monetary, or was it out of some, loyalty to his country?
Great question. It seems to be a combination of all those things. I mean, he is increasingly, he begins to drift out of Catholicism in the late 1580s. But it also seems to be the case that his experience as a Dutchman living in Goa had left him with a bitter taste in his mouth. He was an outsider. And so when he senses an opportunity to make money through the theft of these maps, he grabs them. And he is one of the only people with a key to the physical cupboard that is located in the Archbishop's palace. And he would go at nights and at various times of the day where he would start to, essentially copy these maps. But it was probably a combination of multiple factors. But certainly the fact that Holland had also gone up in flames against the Spanish, basically a revolution trying to overthrow Spanish rule, had made its way back to Lin Scorton in Goa. And I suspect he was probably quite distressed by, what was happening back in Europe.
All right, anybody have any other questions? There's got to be some questions. Is he a very popular figure in Dutch history?
No, surprisingly not. I mean, I've spoken to Dutch friends of mine, historians and others, and they know about him. But there are, other characters who seem to be more prominent. And it's quite surprising to me, because he is such an important character in world history. Again, had he not stolen these maps, look, again, the information would have leaked out. In fact, the information was already beginning to leak out. A map here, a navigational chart there, in the decades before Lin Scorton and the 1590s. But no one had kind of come to the table with this, huge cache of documents and then managed to publish it in 3 volumes. So, in my mind, it's quite a remarkable story, and in a sense, his personal adventures both in India, but then also fleeing back to Holland are quite interesting. But he's not a big character. You don't have tons of history books dedicated to the memory of Lin Scorton in Holland, which I think is kind of interesting. But he, to my mind, is probably one of the most prominent Dutchmen at any point in history, certainly in global history.
Any questions from the group? Was it typical for a 2-year journey from India to Europe?
Yes, it was. It takes about that amount of time. And part of it has to do with the way in which weather patterns work. The monsoons tend to, at certain months of the year, in the summer months, the air, the breeze is moving from the south northwards. So if you happen to be on the eastern coast of Africa, you can catch the monsoon winds taking you north to India. And then they switch a few months later, and the winds move from the north-south, basically from what is now the Central Asian plateau, across now Pakistan into northern India, and then into the Arabian Sea, pushing air back down or pushing the breezes back south. So you can undertake one leg of this journey in the Indian Ocean in 1 year, and then you need a second year to basically travel from Mozambique, South Africa, back to Europe. So it does take about 2 years to do. And it was, again, it's such fun to sometimes, read these accounts of not just, some of these English buccaneers, quote unquote buccaneers, but also people like Lin Scorton. Travel was so extraordinarily difficult. And you had to not just deal with various kinds, the possibility of natural calamities, typhoons and various kinds of storms, storm systems, but also, just their understanding of things like scurvy and other kinds of diseases that you would get, because of a lack of access to vitamin C and various kinds of proteins. Rickets and all sorts of, horrible ailments. And I always tell my students this, that, my students always ask me, like, why would people go to India in this period? And I always say that, they're going because someone is going to land a jackpot. Now, many of them will die. Many of them won't make it to India. And even if they're lucky enough to make it to India, they might die in India. And then making it back from India or Indonesia or Southeast Asia back to Europe raises, yet additional risks. But when these people get back after, however many years they spend in Asia, they are often extraordinarily rich people, especially the merchants, the captains, the money lenders, the creditors, the people who are really kind of sitting at the top of the money pile, so to speak. I mean, they walk away with millions and millions of dollars in today's terms for, investments of often $100,000, $200,000, $300,000. I mean, the returns are massive for anyone who engages in this enterprise.
Very good. We've got a few questions come in through the chat. We've got about 10 minutes. First question is from Abdul. It says, you showed Brazil in one of your earlier slides. Were the Portuguese there also?
Yeah, the Portuguese are along the eastern coast of Brazil. It's interesting because these maps often, they overplay how much control the Europeans actually have in any given area. So in the case of Brazil, the Portuguese control the coastal areas of Brazil and nothing else. So even though maps will show all of modern day Brazil under Portuguese control, much of that was just aspirational. It is what the Portuguese crown said. I mean, we control all of this, but the reality is they didn't control anything beyond coastal settlements. And in fact, they had very little clue as to what was going on, even 25, 30 miles inside, off the coasts of Brazil. But they did have possessions in Brazil. They had possessions in what is now Angola, in Mozambique. But really, it was not till the 19th century that the Portuguese, but also the British, the French, the Germans were able to push inland as they conquered diseases like malaria and various other kinds of diseases. Because even if they had had ambitions of moving into the interior regions of Africa or even South America, invariably they would be killed by various kinds of tropical diseases to which the Europeans had no immunity. So again, treat these maps with a certain skepticism. They tend to suggest really more than anything else what the crowns of the European countries thought they wanted to control as opposed to what they actually controlled.
Very good. Okay, next question from Greg. Back to the 5,000 men and 30 ships. Does that mean that there was only one ship and about 200 men per each of the 25 settlements? And if so, why weren't the Portuguese challenged sooner?
Yeah, great question. Well, yes, you get a sense of just how overextended the Portuguese are. In a place like Goa, which is the capital of the great quote unquote Maritime Empire of Portugal, at no point did they have more than 7 to 8 ships, basically in Goa. But these 7 or 8 ships, had guns on them. The Portuguese had superior guns compared to most of their competitors in the Indian Ocean, certainly. And they also had local allies who they had managed to either co-opt, accommodate, or coerce into supporting them. So it was a combination of Portuguese and Portuguese allies that allowed the Portuguese to really kind of extend their control well beyond what their numbers would have been. And if you're talking about a challenge, the fact is that empires like the Mughals and the Qing, the Manchus in China, were never particularly interested in challenging the Portuguese because they didn't see themselves as naval powers. Whatever goods needed to be moved, the Portuguese would move. The empires themselves were not being taxed. And so they didn't really care if merchants were paying a 5% tax on the goods that they were moving. So the land empires had no interest in challenging the Portuguese. And local groups did not have the means to challenge the Portuguese, whether it was, various kinds of Arab maritime, confederations or Persian confederations or others. And so in a sense, for, a good 100 years, the Portuguese had pretty much a free reign of the Indian Ocean. And it was not till the arrival of the Dutch and then the English that the brittleness of their power was exposed. And again, I just wanted to say that I pointed this out, that in 1612, the English, who are Johnny-come-latelys, they have just arrived on the scene, right? They have not been there for more than a decade. They defeat the Portuguese off the coast of Gujarat in full view of the Mughal emperor. And this goes to show you just how, in a sense, fragile Portuguese power was. But the Portuguese had done a really kind of good job, Visit of Oz-like, to kind of project a certain kind of power that people thought was much deeper than it actually turned out to be.
A couple more. Muhammad points out that the East India Company was in name a joint stock company, but benefited tremendously by how it was able to bribe folks in the House of Lords, at least for several decades until the East India Company was wiped out. And he recommends we read William Dalrymple's The Anarchy, that talks about how the East India Company practiced corporate violence and pillage of Bengal. Any comments on that?
Yes, yes, and yes. For those of you who have never encountered William Dalrymple, he is the bane of most academic historians because he writes these extraordinarily interesting books. He is accessible, he's funny, he's got a gift for telling great stories. Again, his name is William Dalrymple. He's written a whole bunch of books that I would highly recommend to anyone who's interested in reading them. And Anarchy is one of his most recent ones. And he's usually, his instincts are spot on. And the only reason why many folks in my caste don't like him is because he never got a PhD in history and therefore is seen as an interloper who does our job better than we should be doing it. And so he's quite a character, but I admire him a great deal. And yes, he's absolutely right.
All right, well, very good. We have one last question, and this is timely because we're right up against 9 o'clock. Kate asks, are there any movie recommendations on this subject?
Ooh. Wow, that's a stumper. Let me see, any movies that I could recommend?
Or even other books, too, if there's no movie.
Yeah, no, I can't think of any movies just off the top of my head. Maybe folks would have a suggestion. And as to books, there are mountains of books. The problem often is that books aren't particularly accessible. Dalrymple's book about the East India Company is a great book. There are a whole bunch of books, often about the rise of the West and the decline of the rest, as it's often termed. You have to be a little careful around books like that. Oftentimes because there's a certain kind of Eurocentrism and a certain kind of story about, how Europe is so amazing and so distinct to Europe, to Asia, and therefore it explains the rise of European power without taking into account precisely the things that Muhammad had suggested, the predatory nature of colonialism and imperialism. I'm trying to think, I'm drawing a bit of a blank, and I think part of it is just the excitement of having this conversation with you. But I'd be happy to share, if, the person who asked the question drops me an email, it's just my last name at berkeley.edu, Faruqui at berkeley.edu. Just drop me a note and I'll probably have 20 suggestions for you. So feel free to, drop me a line.
Very good. And Muhammad put in the chat, Inglorious Empire by Shashi Tharoor.
Yeah, I've not read it. I've not read Tharoor's book, so I don't know anything about it.
Very good. Well, Munis, this has been great. Thank you very, very much for taking the time to do this quite unusual 10th week guest speaker program. We hope to see you in person at the Gold Stage next summer, at the Blue Stage next summer. But we really, really appreciate you taking the time, and that was really, really interesting. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to all of you audience members. Go Bears, go Lair. Hope to see some of you, all of you, next year. Again, what strange times we live in, but we make the best of the times we are in. So stay safe, stay well, and thank you for everything. And Mike and Pat in particular, enjoy your time at the Lair. We are extremely jealous. Take care, guys.
Thanks, Munis.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.